Hello. The Divine Code reading for December 24th, pages 399 and 400. We are in the chapter Suicide and Sanctifying One's Life for the 7 Noahide commandments. Continuing in topic number 2. And topic number 2 discusses a person giving up his life or sacrificing his life or committing suicide in the case of being pursued by an attacker, either in a time of war or in a time of being attacked by someone where there's no opportunity for getting out of it, and there's no opportunity for defending himself against the attacker. And the example given is King Saul, who was being surrounded by the Philistines in a war situation, and he was so exhausted he could not defend himself. It was toward the end of the battle. His sons had already been killed, and the Philistines were coming around him. There's no way to escape, and he was too exhausted to defend himself, so he was going to be captured by the Philistines, and therefore he took his life. The question is, was he allowed to take his life, and was someone else allowed to help him? So continuing in topic number 2, the victim, that would be like King Saul or someone in that situation, is even permitted to ask someone else to take his life even before the unavoidable attack occurs. And the person who is asked is permitted to comply. So this is a very specific type of situation. And it has to be a physical attack by an assailant that puts the person in this situation. It can't be like the person has disease or something. It's this very specific situation. The footnote, it appears clear that just as it is permitted to commit suicide in that type of situation, this very specific type of situation, it is also permitted for the person to ask someone else to kill him, and the person asked is permitted to comply. This is like the case of King Saul, who was mortally wounded and requested his servant to kill him, as in 1 Samuel 31, verse 4. It is also proven from Bach in Noahide, chapter 157, or Chaim, cited by Bedik Habayit, Noahide 157, and Ritva on Tractate of Avodah Zarah 18a, in the name of Tosafot. So this is a well-discussed area, topic. It's been a lot of people have gone over this topic. However, King David executed Saul's servant. That's in 2 Samuel chapter 1, verses 14 to 16, because he killed the mortally wounded Saul. There are some rabbinic opinions that David's reason was that the servant was forbidden to kill Saul. It seems unlikely to the author, that's the author of the Divine Code, that the servant was forbidden to do so because of a detail of the prohibition of murder. For Saul himself, who acted according to Torah law, asked for this in order to shorten his suffering and avoid being captured and humiliated by the enemy before he died. Rather, there were other reasons that David executed the servant that were specific to that case. So King Saul fell on his sword. He's mortally wounded. He's going to die from it, but still he would be captured in the mean. He wasn't dying right away, and would be captured by the by the Philistines and humiliated, and the kingship of Israel would be humiliated, as well as Saul being. And so in that situation, he asked the servant to finish him off. And so the question would be, he's already mortally wounded. Is it permitted at that point for the servant to finish him off? If it's to prevent the kingship from being humiliated, then that's a very specific case that would almost never repeat itself, hopefully never repeat itself. However, would it be permitted under the area of being under attack that a person would be permitted to help him? Apparently it would be permitted, but the reason why King David had the person executed is because the person came with expecting it to be good news. The person went to King David to report it, expecting King David to be happy that he had killed King Saul. And in order to bring honor to the kingship, it was inappropriate for the servant to treat it as something positive. If he had just simply said, "I feel horrible about this, and I killed him. He told me to kill him, and I killed him because the Philistines were coming," he could have probably been okay. It was because he came treating it as good news, and for that reason, King David had him executed. Not because of what he did, but the way, the attitude that he had about it afterwards. Topic number 3. It seems that one is permitted to commit suicide to save himself from being taken captive or slavery. See Baba Batra 8a, that captivity is worse than death by sword or starvation. See also topic 3.10 below. This also appears to be the reasoning of the Beit Lechem Yehuda Yoredea, chapter 355, quoted by Kida in his Berkei Yosef Yoredea there. However, Kita in his Responsa Chaim Sha'al, volume 1, chapter 46, quoting Kesnef Ha'agedula Yoredea, chapter 157, rules that a Jew may only commit suicide to avoid being murdered, but not to avoid being tortured. This is also the opinion of Beit Ephraim Yoredea, chapter 76, and despite the Talmud's words that captivity is bad as all forms of death, Tractate Baba Batra 8b, there is no guarantee that one will die in captivity. Therefore, although the Torah law that one may consider one who pursues to take the person captive as having intentions for murder, so the pursuer may be killed in self-defense, we don't find a source implying that one may be permitted to avoid captivity by committing suicide. So, if a person is coming to capture someone for the sake of enslaving the person, that can be a fate worse than death. However, that does not give the person permission to commit suicide. It's not the same as the person coming to kill the person, where it might be permitted to commit suicide to prevent being killed in a difficult manner by the captor. So even though it's philosophically and spiritually worse than death, it does not permit the person to commit suicide. Nevertheless, A, The above opinions are only expressed regarding Jews. And B, aside from captivity equaling all forms of death, it can also be considered worse than other types of sufferings if the captor would be force his captive to do whatever he wishes. So it's possible that there are things that the captor is planning that go beyond basic slavery. It therefore appears to the author that for a Gentile, just as it is permitted to save oneself from captivity by taking the life of the pursuing captor. So we're going to learn later on about the pursuer that if a person is coming to capture someone, it is permitted to kill him to prevent it. And that's not considered murder. It is also permitted to take one's own life to be saved from captivity, except if the captivity is a legal sentence of punishment decreed by a court of law. So obviously, if the police are coming for the person, or the bond, if someone's coming to the person in a court proceeding or under the authority of the law, then it's permitted for the person to capture, and if the person who defends himself by killing the policeman, that would be murder. That's not, doesn't fall under the category of someone who's coming to, the slave trader is coming to capture people from a village. That's a different situation. That's not permitted, and therefore the person could defend himself. How much more so is one permitted but not required in order to save himself from sexual abuse, rape, or forced prostitution? So the person, there's certain leniencies. We would be permitted to kill a pursuer who is attempting to enslave the person, like coming into a village to take people for slavery. And it's even a stronger thing in the case if the person's coming to get slaves to work in a farm or in a factory. That's one level of degradation. But if the person is coming to capture people to take them off to a brothel, that would be a much more stronger situation, and there it's considered even more serious than taking the person off to be working a farm. See Tosafos on Tractate of Odazara 18a regarding the group of Jewish children who committed suicide after being captured by the Romans for the purpose of sexual slavery. After the destruction of the Second Temple, it is considered that the children acted righteously and sanctified God's name. It appears that permission to do so also applies to Gentiles. So there's a whole question as to whether or not we were permitted to commit suicide for the sake of sanctifying God's name. Clearly, the Jewish person is permitted and perhaps required to do so. But yet, because of the degradation involved in sexual slavery, it may be permitted for a non-Jew to commit suicide rather than face that. So that it's just a question of degrees, and it's a question of thresholds. At what point would it be permitted? It's possible that it would not be permitted in the case of being taken off as a slave at a farm. As horrible as that might be, your person would have permission to kill to get out of that situation, but the person would not have permission to kill himself, apparently. But in the case of sexual slavery, which is much more serious, the person the non-Jew would have permission, according to what we're seeing here, would have permission to take his life rather than go through that. With one exception, or topic number 4, with one exception, a Gentile is not required to sacrifice his life to avoid transgressing one of the 7 Noahide commandments. That is, a Gentile is permitted to transgress in order to avoid being killed. Now, this is discussed in topic 6 and 7. That's 6 is on the area of forbidden relationships. 7 is in the area of theft. See also part 2, that's in the prohibition of idolatry, and part 4, which is the prohibition of eating the limb of a living animal. Curiously, it's left out of part 3, which deals with the issue of blasphemy, is not on this list, but that would also be an area we're not required to commit suicide to prevent ourselves from doing such a thing. So basically, most of the Noahide laws, we're not required to give up our life in the case of someone forcing us to commit a violation. Alternatively, topic 9, and that's in 2 days from now, we'll be looking at topic 9, below, explains the circumstances under which a Gentile is permitted to give up his life to avoid transgressing any of the 7 Noahide commandments. So the one exception is in regard to committing murder. So in the case of committing murder, we are required to give up our life rather than commit murder. In the other Noahide laws, we are not required to give up our life. The Jew is required to give up his life to prevent himself from transgressing the prohibition against idolatry, and also in the case of prohibition of, I think it was adultery is the other thing, I think. But the Gentile is not required to give up his life in those areas, but he's required in the case of murder. And there are some cases that he is allowed to give up his life. He's not obligated, but he's allowed to give up his life in some cases. That'll be discussed in a future topic in a couple days. Even if one is threatened with losing one's own life or with excruciating torture beyond endurance. See Tractate Ketubot 33b. Suffering severe torture is worse than death. So the person who, when you talk about enduring something, it may be in the face of either being killed for it or in the face of excruciating pain that goes to the point where the person is not able to distinguish if he's alive or dead. Nonetheless, he must submit to being tortured and or murdered rather than murder another human being. The reason for this is to comply with the common sense dictum, is your blood redder than your fellow? See Tractate Sanhedrin 74a, see Parshot Devorim, page 28, based on Rambam, Foundations of the Faith, chapter 5, that it is logical for one to give up his life rather than murder, So this must apply to Gentiles. It is also clear from the Jerusalem Talmud, Tractate Shabbat, chapter 14, towards the end of chapter 14, and the Avodah Zarah 2:5. However, some authorities see Muri in Tractate Sanhedrin into chapter 8, Parshas Devorim, page 28, in the name of Marshal Yosef and Mashkil LeDavid Parsha Vayishlach. Note that Rambam, Laws of Kings 10:2, writes that a Gentile may transgress rather than being killed. And he does not distinguish between any of the Noahide commandments. These authorities therefore infer that murder is also included. So there are some people that would say that the person is permitted to murder under duress. If someone has a gun to his head and says, okay, either you shoot this person or you will be shot, then the person is permitted to kill someone under duress. There's some opinions to that. Still, the ruling of Rambam, Laws of Kings 10:2, is apparently only a reason why murder is like the other Noahide laws, in that Gentiles are not commanded to sanctify God's name, even in the purpose of avoiding murder. Hence, in regard to murder itself, the reason is that the prohibition of murder outweighs a Gentile's own life, is not because of the severity of the sin to God, but because of the logical moral reasoning, is your blood redder than your fellow? So that when looking at the possibility that murder might be permitted in the case of duress, those areas of study are looking at whether the Gentile is required to sanctify God's name. The Gentile is not required to sanctify God's name, and therefore that reasoning to say a person would have to die rather than commit murder does not apply. However, even if that's taken away, it's still not permitted, because how can a person judge that someone else's life is more important than his own? The practical difference discussed in the Jerusalem Talmud, Tractate Terumot, chapter 8, and Yoredeah, chapter 157, is that if attackers tell a group of Jews to hand over an individual Jew to be killed, or else they will all be killed, Torah law forbids them to hand over the individual, even on pain of death, and of many other people, and many additional people. On the other hand, a group of Gentiles may do so if this is in this case in which the logical dictum does not apply, because obviously the blood of many people is redder than the blood of one person. So if it's one person has to kill the second person in order to save his own life, he is not permitted to do so, because it's equal, and the person cannot choose to kill the other person. But if it's a group of people versus one person, then a utilitarian argument is made that the group of people is more important than the one person, and therefore they would be permitted to kill the one person. The difference is that by Torah law, a Jew may violate his commandments if necessary to save his life, with the exception of 3 prohibitions: murder, submitting to idolatry, and sexual relations that are forbidden as capital sins. Even though for the later 2, there is no common sense dictum of, is your blood redder than your friend's? In contrast, Gentiles are not obligated to observe this point of Jewish law. So this point is to sacrifice his life for these three reasons. But they are obligated by the dictum: is your blood redder than that of your fellow? So we're not relying upon the Jewish law to understand this point. We're looking at Noahide law, which operates with a different set of principles that often parallel the Jewish law, but not always. It is not due to any obligation to more strongly uphold the divine commandment against murder, compared to the other 6 commandments that are from God that are associated with this leniency. The practical difference between these two ways of reasoning will be explained below in topic 8. And topic 8 will be two days from now. So also it should be noted that there is a rule that if 2 people are, let's say they're walking in a desert and there's a canteen with water, the canteen only has enough water for one person. The person who owns the canteen of water is the person who drinks it, and he allows the other person to die. That is a passive situation, that the person is not actively killing the other person. The person is not allowed to actively kill the other person to save himself, unless it's the case of a pursuer. But in a normal situation where there's 2 people, one may not actively kill the other person, but the one person may choose to is required to drink water himself and allow the other person to die, if that's the scenario. So it's a difference between active participation in killing and passive allowing the other person to die and to save himself. There's a difference in the two scenarios. Thank you.